I was very busy. You know, we had a young family. I was a headmaster of a secondary school that I was proud of, and I was coaching one of the biggest provincial rugby sides in New Zealand. Loved it. Enjoyed trying to be successful with a group of people. You know, after you've been around rugby for most of your life, you end up forgetting quite a lot of things. Scores disappear. Certain matches get mixed together. Someone will come up to me and say, "Do you remember that game?" And I'll say, "Not really." That's what happens when you've seen thousands of them. But people are different. There are certain players I can still picture very clearly. I can remember the way they walked into training, the way they spoke to the other players, sometimes even the look on their face before a big match. And strangely enough, the ones I admired most weren't always the loudest fellows in the room. Quite often, they were the opposite. They just got on with it. I was lucky enough to coach some extraordinary rugby players. I also spent plenty of afternoons trying to work out how the hell we were going to beat a few of them. That was part of the fun. You'd sit with the coaches during the week, come up with this wonderful plan, convince yourself you'd covered everything, and then some bloke would do something you simply couldn't coach against. I always enjoyed players like that. But talent alone never impressed me for very long. I wanted to know what happened when things went badly. What sort of man were you after a defeat? Could your teammates trust you? Would you still do the ugly work when nobody was watching? Those things mattered to me. And when I look back now at 80 years old, there are 5 players who keep coming into my mind. Not because I'm trying to build the perfect rugby team. I've had enough team selections for one lifetime. These are simply 5 men I admired, 5 players who made me think at one point or another. Yeah, that fellow is a bit different. And the first one was certainly different. Brian O'Driscoll was one of those players you noticed very quickly. You didn't need somebody sitting beside you explaining how good he was. You could see it. I remember watching him when he was still a young man and thinking, there's something here. He wasn't the biggest centre you'd ever seen. He didn't look frightening walking around a hotel lobby. But put him on a rugby field and suddenly he seemed to find spaces that nobody else had noticed. That was what I admired about Brian. He saw things early. As a coach, you spend half your life trying to teach players to recognise space. You put cones down, you stop training, you explain where the opportunity is. Then you get someone like Brian. He'd already seen it. Sometimes before you had, and that can be slightly irritating when you're supposed to be the clever fellow with the clipboard. I remember the Lions tour in 2001 particularly well. Brian was still young, but he didn't behave like a young player trying desperately to prove he belonged. He just played. There was confidence about him, but I never thought it was empty confidence. He believed in what he could do because he'd done the work. Then, of course, came that try against Australia. People still talk about it. I remember watching him go through and thinking for a moment that somebody surely had to catch him. Nobody did. But funny enough, when I think about Brian now, that try isn't the first thing that comes to mind. I remember the competitive side of him more. Brian hated losing. You could see it in him. And I liked that. Not the fellow who throws things around the dressing room and makes a great performance out of being disappointed. I mean, the bloke who sits there quietly thinking about what he could have done better. Brian had that edge. Years later, when I was coaching against Ireland, I saw the other side of it. Now, he was the experienced man. The fellow younger players watched, and he still had that little bit of mischief in his rugby. You never felt entirely comfortable when he had the ball. That's probably the best compliment I can give him. Because whenever Brian O'Driscoll was standing opposite you, you knew your afternoon could become difficult very quickly. I admired him enormously. And I must admit, I enjoyed him much more when he was wearing the same jersey as me. Jonah was impossible to ignore. I don't mean that in the way people usually talk about him. Everybody remembers the size, the speed, the defenders hanging off him. I remember the man. Jonah could walk into a room and you'd notice him immediately. Of course you would. He was enormous. Then he'd start talking and you'd realise he was actually quite a gentle fellow. That contrast always made me smile. On the field, though, goodness me, there were moments when you simply wondered what you were supposed to tell the opposition. I remember watching teams prepare to defend him. They knew exactly what was coming. The coaches knew. The players knew. The crowd knew. Jonah probably knew they knew. And sometimes it still made absolutely no difference. That's rare. Most great players eventually give you something you can work with. You study them long enough and you find a weakness or at least something you can try to exploit. With Jonah, there were days when the tactical discussion became rather simple. Someone had to tackle him, preferably more than one someone. But the thing I admired most wasn't really the famous runs. It was what he dealt with away from them. People forget how much attention followed Jonah everywhere. He became bigger than rugby in many ways. There were people who knew almost nothing about our game who knew exactly who Jonah Lomu was. That can change a young man. It can make him believe the world revolves around him. I never felt that with Jonah. There was still something quite shy about him, something almost boyish. And later, when his health became a much bigger part of his life, I think people began to understand how much he had actually been carrying. He could have been bitter about it. I wouldn't have blamed him. Instead, you'd still see that smile. That stayed with me. We coaches sometimes make rugby far too complicated. We talk about systems and structures and patterns until everybody in the room is half asleep. Jonah reminded you that occasionally the game is beautifully simple. Give an extraordinary man a rugby ball. Let him run. And watch what happens. I saw plenty of wonderful athletes in my time, but I never saw another Jonah. I don't think any of us did. Dan was a funny one. Not funny as in jokes. Dan wasn't the sort of fellow who needed everybody looking at him. Quite the opposite. If you met him away from rugby and didn't know who he was, you might wonder what all the fuss was about. Then Saturday came, and you understood. I remember watching Dan at training sometimes and thinking how ordinary he made everything look. That sounds like an insult. It isn't. He just never seemed rushed. You'd have 20 blokes running around, coaches shouting instructions, balls flying everywhere, and Dan would be standing there looking as though he had all afternoon. Then the ball arrived. Bang. Exactly where it needed to go. That calmness was probably what I admired most about him. People remember the kicking. Of course they do. But there was much more to Dan than that. He understood the game. You could give him a plan, but you didn't want to put him in a little box. The really good players need some freedom. They need to feel what's happening in front of them. Dan could do that. And as a coach, having somebody like him at first five made life considerably easier. I probably shouldn't admit that. Coaches like everyone to believe we're responsible for everything. We're not. Sometimes you sit in the box and watch a player solve a problem you hadn't even thought of. Dan did that plenty of times. What I also remember is how he handled disappointment. That tells you a lot about a person. The World Cup in 2011 should have been his great moment. Everything seemed to be building toward it. Then his body said no. I remember how difficult that was for him. He could have disappeared into himself. Nobody would have blamed him. But he stayed around the team. He helped. He encouraged. He remained down. That mattered to me. Because it's easy to be a wonderful teammate when everything is going your way. Try doing it when the thing you've dreamed about has just been taken away. That's when you learn about somebody. Years later, watching him finally get his moment at the World Cup in 2015, I was delighted for him. Not because Dan needed another medal to prove anything. He didn't. I was delighted because I knew what he'd been through. Dan Carter was one of the most gifted rugby players I ever coached. But strangely enough, when I think about why I admired him, his talent isn't the first thing that comes to mind. It's the way he carried himself. Quietly. No nonsense. Just Dan. Richie was never much trouble. And I mean that as a very big compliment. As a coach, you spend a surprising amount of time worrying about people. Is this fellow happy? Is that fellow upset? Does somebody need a chat? With Richie, you knew what you were getting. He turned up, he worked, then he worked some more. I remember watching him at training and thinking he had this rather unusual ability to make everybody around him feel slightly guilty. He didn't shout at them. That wasn't Richie. He simply trained so hard that the fellow beside him eventually thought, well, I suppose I better get moving too. That's leadership. People often imagine captains giving these magnificent speeches before matches. Sometimes that happens. But most leadership is much less glamorous. It's turning up on Tuesday when your body hurts. It's doing the drill properly when nobody feels like doing it. It's being the same person after a win as you are after a loss. Richie understood that. We went through some difficult moments together. The World Cup in 2007 was obviously one of them. That hurt. It hurt everybody. And when you're the coach and Richie is the captain, people look at the two of you. They want explanations. Sometimes there aren't any good ones. I think that period brought us closer. We didn't sit around feeling sorry for ourselves. Richie certainly wasn't interested in that. We had to get better. 4 years later, I saw just how far he was prepared to go for the team. During the World Cup in 2011, Richie's foot was giving him enormous trouble. You could see it. He could feel it. But try telling Richie McCaw he wasn't going to play. Good luck with that. There were times I wondered how he was doing it. Then the match started, and there he was, again, at the bottom of everything, annoying the opposition, and somehow getting back to his feet. People used to complain about Richie. I always enjoyed that. If the opposition were complaining about your captain, he was probably doing something right. But beneath all of that toughness was a very thoughtful man. Richie listened. He questioned things when he needed to. And when he spoke, people paid attention because he hadn't spent the previous 20 minutes talking for the sake of hearing his own voice. I've coached many captains. I've met many leaders. Richie was different. If I had to walk into a difficult rugby match tomorrow and somebody told me I could choose one man to lead the side, I wouldn't need much time. I'd choose Richie. Then I'd probably leave him alone. He'd know what to do. Sean Fitzpatrick was already Sean Fitzpatrick by the time I really got to know him. That's probably the easiest way of putting it. He had presence. You knew when Fitzy was in the room. Not because he was trying to make sure everybody noticed him. He simply had that personality. He talked. He laughed. He had opinions about almost everything. And if you happened to disagree with one of those opinions, well, you'd better have a reasonably good argument prepared. I liked that about him. Sean came from a different generation to Richie and Dan. Rugby felt different then. The game was changing quickly, but there was still something very old-fashioned about the way those fellows approached it. You played for the jersey. You looked after the bloke beside you. And you didn't make too much fuss about yourself. Sean understood that completely. What impressed me most was his consistency. There are players who can produce something extraordinary once every few weeks. Sean wasn't really about that. He just kept turning up again and again and again. You knew what you were going to get from him. Coaches love players like that. It means one less thing keeping you awake at night. And Sean was tough, properly tough, not the sort of toughness that needs advertising. He'd get knocked around, get back up and carry on as though nothing particularly interesting had happened. I always admired that generation for it. But there was another side to Sean that people sometimes missed. He understood people. He understood the mood of a team. That's incredibly important for a captain. Sometimes a team needs a kick up the backside. Sometimes everybody needs to relax. The clever captains know the difference. Sean usually did, and he wasn't frightened of coaches either. That's important. I never wanted players sitting there nodding simply because the coach had spoken. If something was rubbish, tell me, preferably before Saturday. Sean was perfectly capable of doing that. When I think about the great All Blacks I've seen, there are obviously more naturally gifted players. There were faster men, bigger men, players who could do things Sean simply couldn't do. But rugby teams aren't built by collecting the most talented individuals and hoping for the best. You need people who hold the thing together. Sean was one of those people. He represented something about New Zealand rugby that I always admired. Hard, competitive, loyal, and never terribly interested in making a fuss about it. That's why Fitzy is here. Not because he was perfect. He'd probably laugh if I suggested that. But if you wanted to understand what an All Black was supposed to look like, how he was supposed to behave, and what the jersey was supposed to mean, Sean Fitzpatrick was a pretty good place to start. Making a list like this is probably a dangerous thing for an old coach to do. Someone will always ask, what about this fellow? And they'll be right. There are dozens I could have mentioned. That's the wonderful thing about spending a lifetime in rugby. You meet people you never forget. Some become friends. Some drive you completely mad. Some do both. But Brian, Jonah, Dan, Richie and Sean each left something with me. And it wasn't really about tries or tackles or trophies. Those things matter when you're young. You think winning is everything. As a coach, you certainly behave as though it is. I did. Probably far too often. But when you get older, you remember different things. You remember sitting beside somebody on a bus after a terrible defeat. You remember the player who noticed the young fellow sitting alone and went over to talk to him. You remember training grounds when it was cold and miserable and nobody particularly wanted to be there. You remember laughter. Goodness me, you remember a lot of laughter. That's rugby to me now. I look at Richie and remember his bloody-minded determination. I think about Dan and that quiet way he went about everything. I remember Brian seeing opportunities before the rest of us. I remember Jonah smiling and then becoming something completely different the moment somebody put a rugby ball in his hands. And Fitzy. Well, you always knew when Fitzy was around. 5 very different men. 5 very different rugby players. But there was something they shared. You trusted them. That might be the greatest compliment I can give any player. Because coaches can draw all the clever diagrams they like. We can talk about tactics until midnight. Eventually the players walk onto the field and you sit down. There's nothing more you can do. At that moment, you need people you trust. I was fortunate enough to have quite a few of them in my life. And after all these years, that means far more to me than anything sitting in a trophy cabinet.